Hello everyone. Throughout the past I've said multiple times how I don't agree with the statement that Sunbreak Switch Axe is peak Switch Axe, and I always wanted to make a dedicated video about my exact issues with this claim, because how on earth can I disagree with this almost universally agreed on statement throughout the whole Switch Axe community, especially as somebody who built his channel around playing Switch Axe and as somebody who tries to represent and understand the community the best I can. But first, a big disclaimer. I do not hate or even dislike Sunbreak's iteration of Switch Axe. Throughout playing Rise and Sunbreak, I never put it down. Actually, ever since Iceborne released, I never really played anything else but Switch Axe. My channel started with Rise Switch Axe content. Nobody needs to agree with me, and I do not claim to be objectively right or anything here. This video simply reflects my opinion. I may sound a bit mad throughout the video, and I understand that this can come off as me absolutely hating Switch Axe in that game, but I assure you it is not, and I've had and still have plenty of fun with it. And after reaching the max hunter rank in Wilds, I will go back to Sunbreak and go for master rank 999 in the near future and stream it as well. Maybe I'll change my mind about Sunbreak Switch Axe, who knows. Every single Switch Axe throughout the 5th generation and now the 6th has its own unique style, focus, balance, just like the games themselves, and I love all of them. Switch Axe is my favorite weapon in this series, ever since it was introduced in Tri, which also started my monster hunting career, and honestly it is my favorite weapon type just in general across all games I've ever played. Nothing compares to this unique concept, the movement, fluidity, weapon designs. I can genuinely not see myself switching to another weapon type ever again, unless they introduce a super cool new weapon type or they absolutely horribly destroy Switch Axe, but that hasn't happened yet. No, not even with Wilds. But okay, now onto the gripes I personally have with Sunbreak's Switch Axe. The three biggest issues I have with Sunbreak's iteration of this Switch Axe are its neglect for Axe Mode, management of switch gauge and amp state, as well as the undermining of Axe Mode's role as the mobility/utility part of the weapon, though arguably this issue is an extension of the first one. What do I mean by all that? Well, let's have a look at all the wonderful switch skills and wirebug moves in the game and see what mode they benefit or utilize. We have Invincible Gambit, a hyper armor axe attack that hurls you forward, performing something similar to a heavy slam. The damage you receive is still pretty noticeable, especially on later hunts, so it really isn't. And the damage you deal is kinda lackluster. You also can't really aim it at all that well once you get going, so an okay move at best. You won't use it for its damage, so you may use it to catch up to a monster, but even then there are other arguably better options for that. It also competes in the same switch skill slot as one of the best and coolest moves in Switch Axe's kit and Switch Axe's history, which obviously doesn't help. Aside from that, Axe Mode also has the file bursts from amp state, which is really cool, but in the end doesn't really do much for Axe Mode as a whole. It does increase the damage output on morph loops, however, which is great, and that's it. That is all Axe Mode itself has to offer in Sunbreak. One wirebug move that is decent at best, and the file bursts from amp state, which don't really help it in the long run. But wait, what about Heavy Slam? The big Axe Mode finisher introduced in Iceborne together with Power Axe Mode. In base Rise, all Power Axe Mode did was enhance the build-up of amp meter. That's it. That was all it did. So even Heavy Slam solely benefited Sword Mode. But was it at least useful, so you had a reason to perform 2 wild swings into Heavy Slam? Not really. Not only was it completely useless on anything that isn't a power file, instead of performing the Heavy Slam for the build-up boost, you could instead just perform the Heavenward Flurry in roughly the same time and build up amp meter instead of performing a move that buffs the build-up of amp meter. The boost was noticeable at least, but Heavy Slam was also a more committing attack, which doesn't deal the greatest damage, so there simply wasn't enough incentive to actually use it. Sunbreak then completely killed this version of Power Axe Mode, better known as Maximum Potency, because of this. Which is why they basically had to bring back the part break modifier from Iceborne. That gave Power Axe Mode at least something again, and that was a good change, which can also really help with skills like Blood Ride, which gives you health back when striking broken monster parts. And since your Morph Loop was the DPS chain, it also made some use of that part break bonus if you activated Power Axe Mode. By the way, having the highest DPS loop in Morph Loop is absolutely peak Switch X, and I'm glad we are somewhat back to that in Wilds. Anything else for X Mode? There is the switch skill, which lets you take either the forward slash or forward overhead slash as an opener. Meh. Now in Wilds we have both. The forward overhead slash even has a morph version, and in Sunbreak it was honestly just personal preference. You had many options for openers, including morph attacks or dodge roll morph attacks as well. That's it for X Mode. And I swear to GOG, if anybody tells me, bruh, just let people play however they want, if they want to use X Mode they can, I hope you're new here, because that exact thing is basically what I always preach, especially ever since the full release fiasco with Wilds. Play the weapon how it is the most fun to you. If at the end of your hunt it says quest cleared, you did a good job and you succeeded. But of course it sucks when your personal favorite playstyle is lacking or even extremely lacking in damage output compared to the optimal playstyle. FRS spam was boring as hell, but you could always get good clear times without it. But no record-breaking runs. And X Mode has never been the meta playstyle, and I'm not even asking for that, so let's just continue with the next issue. Gauge management and end state management. In Sunbreak you get way more sword mode attacks from your gauge compared to past iterations, another point for sword mode. Wilds found an interesting middle ground where you get about 30% of gauge back upon entering end state, which is very nice I think, and lets you use your entire gauge to reach end state, while at the same time guaranteeing that you can use sword mode when entering end state. Back in Iceborne, entering end state while running out of gauge was basically a mistake and wastes precious uptime and basically DPS. Not only do we have more switch gauge or less expensive sword attacks, we also have the switch charger. In base Rise, this move was not only used to refill a huge chunk of switch gauge and keep it infinite for around 5 seconds I think, this move has iframes. So it was one of the best defensive options in the game for Switch X at the time, and obviously relocates you so it can be used for positioning as well. It can also be accessed from sword mode, and while it does put you into X mode, you can instantly morph back and you are not attacking, so this is another point for sword mode. Even back in Rise, this made switch gauge basically an infinite resource you didn't have to worry about. It also didn't help that they nerfed evade window in an attempt to balance the overpowered hunters. Then we have Soaring Wyvern Blade. Absolutely sick move, and I have nothing negative to say about it. It is another big win for sword mode, and it competes in the same slot as Invincible Gambit, so yeah, very few people run Gambit even with switching the scrolls. Another contender for this slot is the Wire Step, an amazing evasive and positioning option, also available directly from sword mode. Just like the switch charger, it puts you into X mode, but once again it is arguable whether this should be a win for X mode. Like always, you can just morph instantly back into sword mode and you aren't actively using X mode at all. The fact that the Wire Step and Switch Charger can be accessed directly from sword mode is good, but it undermines the necessity of using X mode for mobility or better evasion than sword mode. You don't have to deal with the poor mobility of sword mode and don't need to actively morph back to X mode like in previous iterations to get your mobility back. Mobility is always at your fingertips. You could also count Soaring Wyvern Blade into that. It can dodge a surprising amount of attacks and then be aimed back at the monster to counterattack. And I know all of these moves cost wire bucks, but please. They aren't a limited resource or anything, especially in later stages of the game with the Matsu Gear and Wind Mantle for example. But okay, let's say you actually use enough switch gauge to drop underneath the morphing threshold and can't access the switch charger right now. Do you now have to use X mode like in previous iterations? No, of course not, because we have the 2-stage Morph Slash. It lets you enter sword mode even below the morphing threshold, builds a huge chunk of amp meter, and the second stage, the Morph back to Axe Mode, refills a decent amount of switch gauge. Another incredible move which I really like, but it is once again only benefiting Sword Mode. Yeah, okay, it at least uses both modes, and Axe Mode builds switch gauge. What a crazy concept. So, you know what? This is a win for both, only because the second stage builds switch gauge. If it didn't, the second stage would be pretty useless anyway. And last but not least, the Elemental Burst counter. Costing 2 wire bucks and draining your switch gauge very quickly, which punishes mistimed counters, it deals a ridiculous amount of damage and instantly puts you into end state. Even power files, which are notorious for requiring some effort to reach end state with. Every single hunt, ever, always, begins by triggering the monster and countering the roar. If done at least somewhat correctly, you had plenty of switch gauge left. End state is active and you probably did enough damage to instantly trigger rage mode, giving you another roar to counter. Another huge win for sword mode. I mean, come on. End state literally less than a second into the actual fight is completely overpowered. But I'll say it again, I love all of these moves and the crazy shit you can do in Sunbreak, but for peak switch X, I personally expect sword mode, Axe mode and morphing to have their place in the gameplay loop. Sword mode is certainly the best and the most powerful it has ever been for Switch X, and I know that we want to spend as much time as possible in sword mode to play optimally and deal the most damage, but I think they went overboard with sword mode in this iteration and forgot Axe mode in the process. Before World, morphing was a lot less prevalent and more restricted than since 5th gen. Axe mode had the mobility and had to be used once your switch gauge was empty, or you refilled the gauge with a stationary reload to get back into sword mode, which was your DPS heavy but slower, less mobile mode. The meta has always been sword mode, which is fine. The challenge was to keep sword mode going as much as possible together with end state since 5th gen, dealing with its very slow movement and poor defensive options. So Axe mode had to be used while your DPS mode was recharging or the monster was too quick and you had few openings to attack with sword mode. World introduced a lot more opportunities for morphing, introduced end state and the ZSD, which became meta together with the mantles. Aside from ZSD, your triple slash chain was a great option for DPS. Iceborne introduced Power Axe mode, which gave Axe mode more utility, and since morph attacks from sword to Axe mode always gave back a small amount of switch gauge, utilizing morph attacks helped you manage your switch gauge to make sure you were always able to enter sword mode when needed. Being below the morphing threshold always meant downtime on DPS and using Axe mode until you can get back into sword mode, ever since the weapon was introduced. This was also the moment where you had to be careful to not lock you into a long stationary reload animation. The two-stage Morph Slash completely ignores this mechanic. Oh, and I almost forgot that this is a switch skill as well, but the Morph Sweep is simply horrible in Sunbreak, and there is absolutely zero reason to use it over the two-stage Morph Slash. And while I think of it, the Morph Sweep would have been the more fitting move for a swift reload while attacking. It is a very committing attack and your hunter could swiftly reload the weapon just before the final actual Morph Slash. But nope. Sunbreak basically went all out on morphing and sword mode, but completely forgot about Axe mode in the process, or at least did way too little to make Axe mode interesting or necessary. The difference in DPS between sword and Axe mode is huge, even with file bursts on axe attacks. But again, sword mode has always been the DPS mode and that is fine. Heavy Slam only got its part break modifier back with Sunbreak because of how terrible Power Axe mode or maximum potency was in base Rise. Gauge management has never ever been this easy, and even if you fuck up and are below the morphing threshold and don't have any wire bugs, you can just use a special morph attack to get back anyway and build back a huge chunk of switch gauge with the second stage. There is no need to manage anything, just like with a counter. instant end state on power files 1 second into any hunt with an uptime of end state of easily around 80 to 90%. The counter gets used constantly anyway because of the insane amounts of damage you deal, and your DPS chain is self-sufficient since it rebuilds some switch gauge thanks to the morph attacks, which is super cool, but reduces gauge management even further. So even for your DPS chain you don't have to worry all too much about switch gauge. Rise was the first iteration of Switch X where a morph loop was the best option for DPS thanks to rapid morph and the file bursts on Axe Mode. In Wilds we now have Rising Slash and Triple Slash as the top dog for sustained DPS alongside FRS, which still deals some insane damage, but there will be times where you run out of switch gauge and have to use Axe Mode if you don't keep your switch gauge somewhat maintained. But in order to maintain your switch gauge, you have to use Axe Mode to get that gauge back, and you maybe want to get an offset for another big burst of damage. There are also 4 different ways to activate Power Axe Mode now. Sneak attack, your regular heavy slam, the follow-up to your focus strike and your offset. In Sunbreak there isn't a time where you have to use Axe Mode, where you cannot quickly get access to end state or sword mode, where you have to deal with the slow movement of sword mode or need the benefits of Axe Mode's mobility. Now I want to point out how Wilds has a much higher potential for the title of Peak Switch Axe, especially after the changes of Title Update 4. Gauge management is back and improved tenfold by letting us rebuild our own gauge with Axe Mode. This is the best decision ever made in regards of gauge management and Axe Mode utility. Many people were complaining about passive reload being gone when the weapon isn't sheathed, but I just love that change. You can reduce the downtime of sword mode a whole lot by using the morph slashes that directly lead into spiral burst slash, which is your bread and butter move for switch gauge. It takes some skill to maintain switch gauge and keep sword mode active as much as possible. Miss your spiral burst? Well, you have the better mobility of Axe Mode and the whole Axe Mode moveset to stay aggressive and regain the switch gauge actively, instead of having to wait for it to fill back up for you like in most past games, or press a button to refill it quickly that also avoids attacks and relocates you. In Wilds you usually start your hunt with a sneak attack and then go for a counter of the first roar and straight into Heavenward Flurry to build up amp meter. Since many monsters have different roar timings after being staggered by the sneak attack and different first attacks after a roar, you have to time your attacks correctly to get the best start possible on every hunt, which is way more engaging for me than getting the monster's attention and countering it for massive damage and instant amp state. Axe Mode has the offset attack, which can result in a massive burst of damage or building up a large amount of switch gauge and activating Power Axe Mode, just like the focus strike with 2 different options for DPS or utility. Power Axe Mode could use a buff, but it increases switch gauge gain and damage for all axe attacks, including the morph attacks. Keeping it active is generally a benefit for Axe and Sword mode, and as I mentioned before, there are 4 different ways to activate it. If we get either the part break modifier or a damage increase, I'd already be perfectly happy with it. And you can't directly access the offset from Sword mode. That is good. That is a good limitation on what Switch Axe can do. You need to think and prepare and predict the monster if you want to use the offset attack. The counter is more of a defensive and utility option rather than a straight, incredibly important part of your DPS. It keeps you in the fight, it keeps the flow going, if timed perfectly it builds up a lot of amp meter and leads directly into Heavenward Flurry. But as easy as it is to pull off, there are downsides to it. You actually get hit by the attack, and mindlessly countering something like Nursilla without proper resistances leads to a quick nap. The stun build up on the counter is really annoying, but aside from that, man, at least it has a downside. It is so easy to pull off, and since Title Update 4 you can hop out of it to instantly trigger it again. The basic DPS chain now is the Rising Slash chain or Triple Slash chain for elemental damage. Morph loops aren't too far behind though, and with a buff to Power Axe Mode could overtake Rising Slashes while also maintaining switch gauge. With Rapid Morph, Amped State and Power Axe Mode it already outdamages Rising Slash Spam, but Rapid Morph right now isn't a high priority for many players, so Rising Slash Spam it is. FRS is far from dead and still a very important part of our damage output, and ZSD, while still far from optimal, has its use cases and can help in breaking specific parts or dealing damage to monsters while they are on the move. I would still love to get Soaring Wyvern Blade back with a slinger motion instead of a wire bug. Rapid Morph isn't a skill tax anymore, which I personally like. As of now, instead of Rapid Morph, you can always choose another damage skill, which will give you more benefit in terms of DPS, I think. Even though I see more and more speedruns where people do use Rapid Morph, but whatever. This may change in Master Rank, but the biggest value for me is the fact that we can quickly switch between Axe and Sword mode, which is really important now to react accordingly to incoming attacks, because unlike Sunbreak, you cannot utilize everything from both modes. The offset can only be accessed from Axe mode, the counter only from Sword mode. I've been saved countless times by Rapid Morph, letting me enter Sword mode quick enough to counter something or morphing back to Axe mode to react with an offset attack. It changed from a skill tax for Switch Axis DPS to a comfort skill with utility and enhancing a morph heavy playstyle. Power Prolonger is now, I'd actually say, essential for power files, but only comfort for element files. In Sunbreak you had it in your kit, because why not, but you didn't need it once you unlocked the counter. If you wanted more uptime on Power Axe mode, yeah, okay, but it wasn't needed or a huge benefit for Amped State like it is in Iceborne or Wilds. But in Wilds Master Rank we may see the same pattern if we get another instant access to Amped State. And more active skills than you could ever dream of. You could argue that Power Prolonger is a skill tax for power file builds, and I could somewhat see that, but power files are so incredibly strong that the reliance on Power Prolonger is a balancing act, because without Power Prolonger you would slot in something that directly increases your damage even further, increasing the gap in DPS between power files and element files even more. And compared to Rapid Morph and Sunbreak, it really isn't that bad in terms of skill taxes. Rapid Morph was always on a Switch X build in Sunbreak, no matter what you build for. That was a skill tax through and through. And I think I'm done. Sunbreak Switch X is peak Sword mode. It is super fun, satisfying, flashy and completely overpowered, but is lacking so much on the X part that I cannot call it peak Switch X. The switch gauge lasts longer, is easily recovered at the press of a button, there is a lot of morphing back and forth, which is great, but you can count the attacks you actively do on X mode on one hand throughout an entire hunt. The mobility of X mode is not really needed anymore because Sword mode has all the mobility it needs thanks to wire bug moves and morph attacks. Nobody needs to agree with me, and this is just how I feel about the weapon. I like Wild's iteration a lot more than Sunbreak's, but I understand why people say Sunbreak is peak Switch X. Feel free to give me some counter arguments in the comments if you'd like to, or if you have any questions about what I said. As I said before, I will go on an extensive journey on Sunbreak very soon and play Switch X, and maybe I'll change my mind. I'm absolutely open for that, and it has been a while since I actually played, but I did play it. A little bit. Every second with Switch X of course, and yeah, we'll see. And no matter which version of Switch X you like the most, happy hunting everyone.